Hi, this is Paul. As is often the case, the video I intend to do grows into something else. I started out this morning thinking about these three, people who have gone from Protestantism back to ancient mothers. In the case of Gavin Ashenden to the Roman Catholic Church, and in case of the Peugeot brothers to the Orthodox Church. And this is a very interesting development. Ashenden was just yesterday on Karen Wong's channel, The Meaning Code. Karen lives not too far from me. Karen's been at my local meetup. Karen's been on my channel. I've been on Karen's channel. Karen does regular conversations with a number of the people in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. Karen's an artist. She's on her own quest for truth, early fan of Jordan Peterson. If you look on my channel, Karen has quite a story, and I really love what she's done with her channel. And unlike me, when Karen sees somebody out there wants to have a conversation with, she goes right after them. And so she had a lovely conversation with Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who had recently done a video on Jordan Peterson that I mentioned in a previous video. And I really appreciated Karen's video because she did what I usually do. She dug deep into his story, which gave us quite a bit more background on the good doctor and his desire, why he moved back to Roman Catholicism. There's also a very interesting interview with him out on the Delingpod podcast. Delingpod had that very interesting interview with Tom Holland a couple of years ago. Anyway, Dr. Ashenden, was a very interesting story. Listen to her video. But was an Anglican, saw Anglicanism, I think as many do today, as sort of a best of both worlds, an ability to sort of incorporate the Roman Catholic or the sacramental traditions and some of the elements of the Protestant Reformation. And it was very interesting. But then he discovered, and there's more details on this on the Delingpod podcast than necessarily on Karen's, but actually really sort of different kinds of details. Really didn't imagine that the Church of England was going to be able to stand up to what I called in my last video the successor religion in the UK, and so fled to the Roman Church and has been happy there, and then started a YouTube channel. And this whole conversation he had with Karen was simply a delight. Now, I set out, and might still do, we'll see what I feel like towards the end of this video, because I've got a lot of reading to do during this video. I was going to just continue on in my series of Mathieu Pajot's Language of Creation. It's interesting that the subtitle is a commentary, and the books behind me here are all commentaries, and it's not really like any commentary I have. I'm very accustomed to using commentaries. I own hundreds of them and use them all regularly. Julian once asked me, do you use those books behind you? Yes, I do. I just don't pull them off the shelf when I'm making videos. The Peugeot brothers grew up in a deeply committed evangelical family. And I've mentioned many times that none of us really escape our roots. And so a lot of the former evangelicals who are moving to Orthodoxy bring some of what they were to Orthodoxy. And I don't mean that as an insult or a put down. I mean, we all bring where we were to where we go. And so, I've been reading, I'm always reading something. The roots of evangelicalism, I've been doing a lot of thinking in my recent videos, if you've been watching my videos, as you notice, about politics and evangelicalism. The roots of evangelicalism really belong more in the Swiss Reformation than in Luther's Reformation. And these strands have deeply influenced people far beyond even those who self-consciously consider themselves Christian these days. And the more I read Mathieu Pajot's book, I'm sure I'm just butchering his name, the more I see it as really an evangelical attempting to reappropriate a tradition and to and to work through a lot of the issues. But, so often when I read the language of the book, it strikes me as so evangelical. Now, again, that's not a put down. I'm not using that as a smear or anything like that. And I hope that the Peugeot brothers don't take it as such, because I'm a very big fan. But it's just hard, and this again is part of Tom Holland's thesis, it's just hard to get away from this stuff in the West, because this history is so deep. And the more I read this stuff, it amazes me how this history forms us, and we're simply unaware of it. One of the things I saw immediately when I saw Gavin Ashenden's video of Jordan Peterson, I might be wrong here, but it sure looks like the book that I've been reading, which is Carlos, is it Erie? I don't know how he says his name. Reformations, the Early Modern World, 1450 to 1650. And I got tipped off to this book by Tom Holland, mentioned it on a podcast. And I listen for book recommendations, and the cover is a famous statue that was brutalized in an iconoclastic attack, let's say. And you can look up the statue and the history of it. It's very, very interesting. But the book, I was reading the book for a while, then I put it down because I was reading other things, and now I picked it up again and really got into the chapter on the Swiss Reformation, which really opened my eyes. The point of the book, which is a point made by many other historians, because history keeps changing. And what I mean by history keeps changing, the writing of history keeps changing. And I was very much schooled I pretty much got the standard treatment that most Dutch Reformed CRC people would get, which is a fairly flat, fairly low-resolution view of the Protestant Reformation, a lot of hagiography, Luther and Calvin can do no wrong and are the true heirs of Augustine. But the more I think through these issues, a lot of the issues that I'm going to be reading about in the book today, there's so many different threads woven over time through these events and how they've come to us through church history and through politics and through culture. Well, let's get into the Swiss Reformation. When I started reading the book, I was pondering how poor my preparation of the Swiss Reformation had been. Of course, I knew who Zwingli was, and I could distinguish between, well, I thought I could at least. And again, our friend Brett Sockold has given us a really lovely book on transubstantiation, but you could distinguish between transubstantiation, the Roman Catholic position, consubstantiation, the Lutheran position, real presence, the Calvinist position, and this sort of in symbol only posture on the sacrament by the Zwinglians. And just recently, I should probably pull the book up. Not too long ago, Peter, I should say Kreeft, because the Dutchmen always complain about how I butcher the Dutch language and I should know better. But Peter Kreeft, we are both alumnus of Eastern Christian and Calvin College before he defected to the Roman Catholic Church, breaking the hearts of many Dutch Calvinist scholars at Calvin College. But Peter Kreeft just recently wrote a book, Symbol or Substance, and Peter Kreeft has written a lot of dialogues. He sort of likes to use that method. And it's a conversation between, imaginary conversation between C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien, of course, a devout Roman Catholic. Lewis, of course, an Anglican. And Billy Graham, of course, critical leader of the neo-evangelical movement in the mid-20th century in the United States. And we've talked about Billy Graham a little bit in the past. And, part of what comes out of this book is the deep influences of Zwingli and the Zwinglian position throughout American evangelicalism. Conversation with my friend Len Vandezee. Get the book in. Len Vandezee wrote a wonderful book, Christ, Baptism, and the Lord's Supper. I can never get it quite right in the... and by IVP Press. And this is one of the first books that I read that really made me start to think about sacraments, and that was before the whole Jordan Peterson business. But Len, very important leader in the Christian Reformed Church, listened to a lot of what was going on and thinking, is that what Calvin believed? And so he did this study and eventually wrote this book. Len's a terrific writer and a terrific preacher and a terrific Christian. So these issues have been around and are really quite important. Now, the Swiss had a rather unusual political situation and religious situation with respect to both the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. They were really quite buffered both from papal authority and imperial power of the emperor. And the book lays this out quite nicely, Reformations does. And Zwingli's revolt is really parallel and maybe even a little before Luther. And there are many cases, which the book talks about, where Zwingli, in some ways, he comes out very strongly against indulgences, and he's backed by his bishop. And so there's simply no blowback. But that doesn't happen in Luther's case, and so you have the blow-up. That sort of indicates that the imagined complete tyranny in late medieval Catholicism was consistently enforced. It certainly was not. But Zwingli doesn't get the same response that Luther got, or really the same attention or treatment. But I think this book makes a case that in many ways Zwingli's Reformation is broader and more enduring than Luther's. And Luther gets all the attention, but it probably should be the Swiss Reformation that gets most of the attention, because most of the vital Christian branches of the tree today, well, so their main branches, you have the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and then the Protestant. And within the Protestant, you've got the Lutheran Church. But the Lutheran Church is relatively small compared to what will grow out of the Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation, which will be both the Anabaptist tradition and the broader Reformed tradition. And you really have to separate and distinguish between, let's say, Zwingli and Calvin, between Zurich and Geneva, as this grows, especially with respect to, well, depending on whether or not Len is right, with respect to the Lord's Supper. For nearly 5 centuries now, a question has lingered: to what extent was Zwingli influenced by Luther in 1518? Zwingli denied that he ever followed Luther's lead in any way and never gave Luther any credit, saying that long before Luther was known in Switzerland, he himself had already begun to preach the pure gospel, and that he had learned about the fraud of indulgences from his mentor Wittenbach in Basel. Whether or not Luther influenced Zwingli matters little in the long run, for it is quite obvious that Zwingli did indeed experience a significant conversion before Luther became well known, and that the two men disagreed on several key points and came to distrust each other. So, they both in some ways share sola scriptura. They both share Zwingli. They both share Erasmus. But in many ways, Zwingli is a more faithful disciple of Erasmus than Luther was. This is where personality and history really come together. Luther is just such a guy who is low in agreeableness. You push Luther, he pushes back. Early on in my channel, you can find it, I had a conversation with Ron Dart about Jordan Peterson, and my assertion was Peterson and Luther, temperamentally seem a lot alike, because you push Jordan Peterson, he pushes back. You push Luther, he pushes back. Where Luther began was quite a bit more moderate than where Luther ended up, but in comparison with Zwingli, where Luther ended up was still quite a bit more moderate than Zwingli, and especially the Radical Reformation or Anabaptist tradition that eventually grows out of Zurich. Now, some of which, this is a big discussion in terms of historians, because, okay, Carlsbad, might likely be owned by the Anabaptists, and Carlsbad sort of comes out of Luther's point. And this, I've, listened to enough Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland now that, some of these historian debates about, well, was it these men who launched this movement, or were the men sort of the final popping off points for the spiritual forces that were at work in the imaginary? And it's often said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, and here Carlos Erie says that's totally mistaken. Zwingli truly hatched Erasmus's reforming egg. Luther would merely scramble it. While Luther's conversion began with the biblical text of the Psalms and Romans and focused solely on the issue of justification, Zwingli's began with a poem of Erasmus, with a focus on ritual and piety and on the question of proper witness. These two different starting points would remain firmly fixed at the center of each reformer's hermeneutics, and prevent them from ever agreeing with each other on the meaning of symbols and rituals and on the larger goals of the Reformation. Zwingli gave no exact dates for his Erasmius conversion, but he admitted it took place sometime between 1514 and 1515. Remember, Luther's blow-up in Wittenberg is 1517. The brief life-altering poem in question was titled The Complaint of Jesus. Now, again, I've read a couple of years ago a terrific book on Erasmus and Luther, and again, Luther just gets all the attention. Fatal Discord. The Complaint of Jesus, which lampooned the cult of the saints and popular attitudes towards prayer. Now, Erasmus wished to consider himself a faithful servant of the Roman Church. But Erasmus was a critic of many things that many who followed Erasmus would also be critical of and take it further. Speaking in the first person, Jesus bemoans that he has nothing to do in heaven because no one ever prays to him. Bored and restless, he complains that everyone prays to the saints instead, especially to his mother, the Virgin Mary. Zwingli's own description of his response to this poem, written several years later in 1523, lays out in explicit detail the nature of his conversion and of the reforming vision that would guide all of his work from that point forward. This is Zwingli. I shall not keep from you, most beloved brethren in Christ, how I arrived at the opinion and the firm belief that we need no mediator other than Christ, and also that no one other than Christ alone can mediate between God and us. 8 or 9 years ago, I read a consoling poem about the Lord Jesus by the most learned Erasmus of Rotterdam, in which Jesus complains, in a most beautiful way, that men did not seek all good in him in order that he might be a wellspring of goodness for them, a redeemer, comforter, and treasurer of the soul. And then and there I was convinced that this was true indeed. Why then should we seek help from any creature? Good Erasmian that he had become, Zwingli turned directly to the Bible, which he had already accepted as the supreme authority, and also to church fathers of the 2nd through 5th centuries. Now that's important, and that is something that is often overlooked. That was from you, Henry. You're making a call during the video, and you're once again going to brag about how you, Henry, and you know which Henry I'm talking about, went from being a good Protestant over now into cheering the Roman Catholic Church. So if you wonder why I dismissed your call, there it was. Anyway. Oh, and now he's trying again. I can't talk now, Henry. I'm making a video. Back to the Church Fathers. So when my friend Eric, who's been on my channel, came to Sacramento, and Eric was part of this sort of these neo-sacramentalist, neo-Catholic, Christian Reformed lads there are a few of them around the denomination, telling me how much John Calvin wrote about the church fathers. That certainly wasn't emphasized in my Christian Reformed education in the 70s and 80s. How interesting. But here it is. Church fathers to the 2nd and 5th century. Very instrumental in Zwingli, whom he accepted as the best interpreters of Scripture. Now remember, I'm getting to this by thinking of the Peugeot brothers. And they would agree with Zwingli on this point. And remember, they also come out of, I don't think I asked a lot of specifics, but I suspect they were Baptists. Now, Baptists are interesting because some Baptists have very strong Calvinist roots. Other Baptists have more Zwinglian roots. But again, as Peter Kraft is noting, perhaps we're seeing some of this in terms of and can track some of this in terms of the sacraments. Anyway, finding no mention of the cult of the saints in the Bible and very little in the Fathers, Zwingli turned away from the medieval Catholic piety and down the path toward a total break with the past. In this point, then, Zwingli was already convinced of the primacy of the Bible, something akin to Luther's sola scriptura, and of the need to scrutinize all piety by scriptural guidelines. And as Erie describes in quite vivid detail the Swiss Reformation, it's fascinating the zeal in the streets of the iconoclasts for the Bible and against the Roman Church and against the things that stood for the Roman Church. And that zeal echoed throughout the centuries and seemed to be quite easy to pass on through Protestant ranks as years to come. And I think also, there's always sort of this interesting relationship between the Protestant Reformation and the peasant revolts. Now, of course, Luther was quite brutal in terms of putting down the peasant revolts. Zwingli also was a magisterial Protestant. What that means was he was sort of on the side of the magistrates. But when you get into the radical Reformation and the Anabaptists, that's really where it becomes a deeply populist movement. In this respect, he had arrived at a very similar conclusion regarding scriptural authority by means of a very different route. But the differences are manifest in the similarities. Zwingli was more intensely focused on the issue of worship and intercession. This is really interesting. And on the need to return to a strict Christocentric piety than on the soteriological questions that so consumed Luther's attention. I'm going to read that sentence again because that distinction is going to play out in Erie's treatment of these two and comparing and contrast. Zwingli was more intensely focused on the issue of worship and intercession and on the need to return to a strictly Christocentric piety than on the soteriological, that's the salvation, justification by faith issue, questions that so consumed Luther's attention. His burning preoccupation became how to best approach God and relate to him, not how to find forgiveness. And as we're going to see a little bit later, that plays out in how the Swiss Reformation, Calvin included, approaches sort of world and life view issues. Now, I'm not taking this in sequence from the book. I'm just taking these snippets, and there's a fair amount of material on Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation before the section on the Radical Reformation, so I'm just taking snippets of it from different places, and I'm also moving them around. Some of the earlier quotes actually come from later in the chapters and some later earlier. The progress of Reformation in Switzerland can be traced most efficiently and revealingly by following the trail of iconoclastic ruin. From Zurich, iconoclasm spread in waves to smaller communities under its jurisdiction, and in turn to other major cities and their territories. Bern and St. Gall would follow suit in 1528. Constance, Basel, and Schaffhausen in 1529. Neuchâtel in 1530, and Geneva in 1535. Geneva, interestingly enough, is relatively late. Of course, John Calvin is French. He takes on like many of the humanists, it's helpful to understand what a youth wave Renaissance humanism was. It's what all the cool kids were studying. In addition, under the jurisdiction of these larger cities, there were numerous smaller communities where the old religion was attacked and dismantled. Older histories of the Swiss Reformation have a keen awareness of the significance of iconoclasm. Contemporary chroniclers such as Johannes Stumpf and Jean de Jussy, for instance, structured their narratives around the attack on traditional symbols and rituals. It made no difference that Pastor Stumpf was Protestant and Sister Jean a Catholic. Back then, both parties knew that the Reformation was all about hand-to-hand combat over symbols and rituals. That's so different from, let's say, the story that I was raised with, where the Protestant Reformation was all about theology. Well, it certainly was about theology, but I would imagine that theology is probably a secondary manifestation, and the much more aggressive attacks on symbols and rituals is early. Theology, the rider on the elephant, probably comes later. It made no difference that, 3 centuries later, major historians of the Reformation, such as J.H. Merle, I gotta learn French, were still aware of the significance of the pattern. He depended on iconoclasm for his narrative structure and also wisely used it as an interpretive lens, observing that in times of the Reformation, the doctors attacked the Pope and the people the images. That's hugely important. The doctors attacked the Pope and the people the images. The pattern of reform in Switzerland is laid bare by iconoclasm for a very simple reason. The war against the idols, the statue, the iconography, always brought the conflict with the old status quo to a head. Now, what's really interesting is if you look at this pattern, you can see it played out in all sorts of contemporary church fights and political fights. So the war against the idols always brought the conflict with the old status quo to a head, since it questioned the legal status of the images and the Mass. Now, a lot of this religious art was quite valuable, as he makes the point another place in the book, and the value was held in private hands. And so, and we bumped into this with the iconoclasm that we've seen in the streets recently. Wherever the Catholic Church was still legally ensconced, iconoclasts always had to be tried for their crimes, and the trials had the unique potential for bringing the religious conflict to some sort of resolution. You see this in the civil rights movement. You see this, for example, in the Supreme Court overturning all the state laws against same-sex marriage. Notice that interesting pattern. Wherever the Catholic Church was still legally ensconced, iconoclasts always had to be tried for their crimes, and the trials had a unique potential to bring the religious conflict to some sort of resolution, whether by public debate, popular vote, or magisterial decision. It's very interesting, for example, in the Christian Reformed Church, the current battle over same-sex marriage. People who have wanted, these were the same tactics used in the battle over women's ordination, do it, and then see if they prosecute you. That's basically Neeland Avenue's strategy today. The pattern set in Zurich was followed nearly everywhere else in Switzerland. First, the old symbols and rituals would be challenged through iconoclastic acts. Then, the legality of these acts would be openly debated in a disputation where the iconoclastic reformers hoped to prove that the Bible was the sole authority and that it demanded the abolition of images and the Mass. Isn't that interesting? As in Zurich, it would be the civil powers, the lay oligarchy that ruled the city, that would approve the Reformation. And this is a pattern you see in the Protestant Reformation over and over and over again. It's deeply entwined with politics. The entire movement. Again, Luther would not have lived if his elector had not squirreled him away in the castle to save his life. It's the strange patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire that facilitates this. And again, in the contrafactual episode of The Rest is History, they asked the question, what if England and France stayed united? What would have happened in terms of the Protestant Reformation? What if Henry VIII had had a son? Interesting questions. As in Zurich, it would be the civil powers, the lay oligarchy that ruled the city, that would approve the Reformation. And with the abolition of the old religion, a whole new church and a new society would be established, and a very different relationship between church and state. Now that is critical here, because these foundations set in the Swiss Reformation are going to set up what comes over with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and all the dissenters that will make their way to North America. And so in that way, the Swiss Reformation is likely more foundational for the establishment of this strange mixture of politics and religions that we have in the United States than Luther's Reformation. Zwingli's main objective as a theologian and a reformer was to discriminate between true and false religion. Very antithetical, and I'll often mention Abraham Kuyper, who has this strange relationship between common grace and the antithesis. And I often talk about this with respect to analog versus digital. I'll talk about it with respect to bounded set versus center set theories of groups and structures. Zwingli's main objective as a theologian and reformer was to discriminate between true and false religion and to discern the ultimate object of Christian belief and behavior. Influenced as he was by humanism, and especially, get this, by Neoplatonism and Erasmus. Well, that opened my eyes. Again, how many of these conversations between Peugeot and Vervaeke aren't we knocking on this door of Neoplatonism? Again, if you haven't watched Sam Adams' conversation with John Vervaeke on Neoplatonism, you should. Zwingli conceived of religion as more than merely theology. Religion was a way of life to him, a total integration of the individual and the community with a higher reality in the here and now. And again, this will transmit itself very deeply into the American experiment through the English dissenters who will make their way to the new colonies in the New World. Zwingli's religion was above all practical problem-solving endeavor to align oneself and one's world as much as possible with the divine will. Now, when we get a little bit later into the question of metaphysics and ongoing question of this channel, how can we conceptualize what we mean by this word spiritual? That's right in there, okay? Zwingli's God was a transcendent one who dwelt in the realm of the spirit and demanded to be worshipped as such. In other words, all the statues and even the sacrament itself, its physicality was a problem. And already you see this division between matter and spirit. And this is where Peugeot's book gets interesting, because that book is all about what's the relationship between heaven and earth, between matter and spirit. And where does humanity fit into that? And so you see all of these issues are very much at play. And we see that to one degree between Luther and Zwingli. Zwingli's God was a transcendent other, capital O, who dwelt in the realm of spirit and demanded to be worshipped as such, without material mediation, and that will be key. largely because of the influence of Florentine Neoplatonism. Now this is something I'm going to have to dig up. And Erasmus, Zwingli was keenly focused on metaphysics, and especially on the distinction between spirit and matter, which he considered two distinct realms. Very interesting. Because I see this in the current debates, God number one and God number two, in terms of Sam Harris, in terms of sacraments, all of these deeply held assumptions that they're, they're sort of the way people feel their way around their imaginary. In this, Zwingli differed greatly from Luther, for whom matter and spirit were not polar opposites. Again, maybe I should probably send this video or maybe this book. Where's my Brett Sockold book? I gotta hold it up. Maybe it's over there. But this is transubstantiation, real presence. All of these issues sort of get concentrated into the question of the sacraments. And a little bit later, I'm not going to read that part, a little bit later with the attempt to sort of unify these disparate Protestant elements will fall apart between Luther and Zwingli precisely over this issue. In this, Zwingli differed greatly from Luther, for whom matter and spirit are not polar opposites. Zwingli's matter-spirit dialectic and his sense of God's utter transcendence stand at the very center of his thought, and also at the heart of his most pragmatic reforms. Distrust of mediation, Zwingli insisted that the true object of Christian belief and behavior is to have this transcendent God as the ultimate focus of faith and worship. Now, this is going to get very interesting because Zwingli's own brand of utopian city development, which Calvin will get some of. So some of this comes to me via Calvinism, and we'll get to the Puritans who established New Haven, Connecticut. If you look at my channel, very interesting conversation with someone from New Haven. The city on the hill, all of this stuff comes through Zwingli. And when you think about this, humanity, this is where it gets interesting with Peugeot's book. Humanity is the mediation in this view of it has to come through us and get put out into the world. It isn't mediated through a sacrament. It's mediated through mind. And so with this now, as I continue to read Peugeot's book, things are going to get very interesting because in some ways, in Luther's world, who is much more Catholic, much more of a medievalist, humanity is sort of ensconced in the world. And so Luther sees devils and, Zwingli, quite a bit more ascetic. Is he more Gnostic? And this Gnostic element that we see coming about in dispensationalism, in various evangelical strains. Well, here, perhaps we see some of its roots here in Zwingli. Distrust of mediation, Zwingli insisted that the true object of Christian belief and behavior is to have this transcendent God as the ultimate focus of faith and worship. Right worship, that is, worship as commanded by God. Now, some of you in the Presbyterian church, that's going to set your bells off because 10, 15, 20 years ago, big fights in the Presbyterian and to a degree in the CRC, the parts of the CRC that have been more and more influenced by some of this Puritan influence, where there's this is where, and it comes through the Westminster Confession. This is we are not allowed to worship God, and it's in the Heidelberg Catechism too. We are not to worship God in anything that isn't specifically prescribed in Scripture. Now, that gets difficult because, Calvin's Geneva, for example, they sang psalms. And the Christian Reformed Church, early on in its history in North America, was only a psalm-singing church. Part of what got dismantled in the Swiss Reformation in many places were pipe organs. Pipe organs are not prescribed in the Bible, obviously. But you see the patterns there. Sharp distinctions were the marrow of Zwingli's religion. As Zwingli saw it, anyone who failed to worship God alone was in error. They are not believers who go to anyone else for help other than to the one true God. For thus are the believers differentiated from the believers that different from the unbelievers, in that the believers are those who are trusting go to God alone, but the unbelievers go to the created. Okay. So right there you see sort of the heart of iconoclasm and the heart of their theology of the sacraments. Zwingli was adamant that true religion could not admit any mediation through matter. They, then, who trust in any created thing whatsoever are not truly pious. What is uncreated? Well, uncreated is my experience of the divine. Now, we're going to see this in contemporary non-Christian spiritualities in the United States. What is unmediated is my epistemological standpoint of what? Of anything. My secret, sacred self. No one can tell me what I truly am because, we begin to see romanticism. We begin to see elements of, let's say, New England transcendentalism. All of this stuff is not... Now, Zwingli, of course, would have denied these things because it's us reading the Bible. That's how we're connected to God. And you can see that in deeply evangelical places. Zwingli was adamant that true religion could not admit any mediation through matter. Going even further, Zwingli turned his principle into something resembling a mathematical equation. And they give the Latin, which loosely translates as, whatever binds the senses diminishes the spirit. Boy, that's interesting. Zwingli's activism, which makes him so different from Luther, derives precisely from this notion of faithfulness. Serving God correctly is the goal of the Christian life, both personally and communally, whereas Luther's principal dialectic is that between law and gospel. Zwingli's is that between faithfulness and faithlessness, or true religion and false religion, or obedience and disobedience. All three dialectical pairs are one and the same for Zwingli. Unlike Luther, who could only conceive of a paradoxical synthesis between law and gospel, and that of an ethic in which the constant breaking of the divine law is inevitable, summed up in this simul justus et peccator formula, Zwingli believes that the law is a gospel for the man who honors God. And now we're going to see Calvin in some ways between Zwingli and Luther, because Calvin's going to bring these things together. And I haven't gotten to the point of the book where we deal with Calvin, but I'm really anticipating that. The commands, therefore, were the constant will of God working through the world. Unlike Luther, for whom works righteousness was an offensively wrong concept, Zwingli devoutly believed in the regenerative power of faith and in the measure of reward for effort. Faithfulness, in fact, is the same effort for Zwingli, for whom life was a constant battle that could be won not just in the hereafter, but also in the here and now. Such interesting contrasts. The life of a Christian, he said, was a battle so sharp and full of danger that effort can nowhere be relaxed without loss. It is also a lasting victory, for he who fights it wins, if only he remains loyal to Christ, his head. A lot of this will come through with Calvinism. And this is where, People who the only thing they know of Calvinism is divine election don't know anything about Calvinism, because if that was all that Calvinism is, why would Calvinists throughout time be so activistic? Same with Zwingli. Okay, all this through the Swiss Reformation. Remaining loyal, of course, entails both right worship and right behavior. If Zwingli retains any sense of paradox in his theology, it is his conception of divine providence. Convinced as he was that human effort played a role in redemption, Zwingli also believed that God ultimately controlled everything, including who would be the faithful. Although he never dwelt on predestination or elaborated on the concept systematically, Zwingli spoke of election and sometimes even used the term predestination. As when he said, predestination is born of providence, nay, is providence. Far from a fatalist, Zwingli believed in predestination that turns the elect into energetic agents of the divine will. But now again, there's no mediation of God through matter, only through the mind and through human beings out into the material world. And the flow of that is critically important in terms of the difference. Doing a John Vervaeke thing here, we're going this way or this way. That's probably not at all what John does, but it just can't talk with my hands without thinking about John. In fact, it was precisely because the divine act of choosing was a mystery that one was commanded to be active, for predestination was not about one's merit, but about God's displaying his power and mercy through human agency. And you're sort of setting up the Weber thesis there, that why were Calvinists such activists? Because by their actions, they were demonstrating their election. Godly cities. Turning all citizens into good Christians. Now notice here, you're going to have often when we talk about one speed versus two speed, what Charles Taylor picked up in A Secular Age, I think, is exactly this. And you can see it in Jonathan Pageau's conversations about the margin. You have to maintain the margin. You still have Fat Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. And Charles Taylor picks up a lot of this stuff in A Secular Age about, well, the way the world lays out, you still have places for monsters. But Zwingli and all of this stuff that gets picked up, this and you'll see this carrying through in even woke, that, well, okay, so now we have colleges where gay students can date each other, but we cannot abide by places where, Christian colleges, let's say, that hold out and don't want to permit that. We talk about diversity, but that's not a diversity we can tolerate. And so this is where Pageau sort of sets up his ideas about the margins and the center. But here with Zwingli, you have this much more utopian, pervasive attempt to instantiate the will of God in the city. Turning all citizens into good Christians was the principal aim of the Swiss reformers, and another key difference between them and the Lutherans up north. Whereas Luther deepened his paradoxical simul justus et peccator approach to good works, and to his equally paradoxical two kingdoms political theology after 1525, and that two kingdoms theology with respect to politics continues to be a conversation piece in conservative, reformed, and a variety of conservative Protestant circles today. Zwingli and his associates in Switzerland and southern Germany became wholly committed to building communities in which good works and obedience to the Ten Commandments were expected. Any Christian Reformed church you would visit before the 1970s, you would be used to hearing the recitation of the Ten Commandments. When I visited Old First Reformed in Brooklyn, very interesting church. I just got to think about how much I want to say about it. Right there up on the wall, the Ten Commandments. Zwingli and his associates in Switzerland and southern Germany became wholly committed to building communities in which good works and obedience to the Ten Commandments were expected, and in which church and state worked hand in hand to ensure faithfulness, pure worship, and good behavior. Now, notice in the successor ideology or the successor religion how much these Swiss Reformed ideas are playing through. Now, but the Bible is now sort of set aside, but this impulse remains the same, which sort of leads you to say, well, maybe it's an impulse far beyond just these particular circumstances. Maybe there's a temperamental, biological, psychological dynamic at play at least as well here, not just a theological one. Consequently, although the Swiss and the Lutherans shared the same soteriology, believing in salvation by faith alone, the Swiss took a less paradoxical approach to the pervasiveness of sin in the individual and society. While Lutherans stressed the inevitability of sin in the individual and the community, you can get that through Peugeot too, and the dissonance between faith and behavior, the Swiss emphasized the transforming power of faith, especially of faith under the aegis of the state. In other words, whereas Luther stressed the forgiveness of sins and the enduring corruption of the world, the Swiss insisted on the avoidance of sin and the perfectibility of community. Whereas Luther taught that everyone was a constant sinner, that a Christian prince was a rare bird, and that the kingdom of Christ was simply a promise for some post-apocalyptic future, the Swiss insisted that sin could be controlled and that the state itself had a duty to suppress it and to build a kingdom of Christ on earth here and now. To put it in practical terms, a Swiss Reformed community had no place at all for anyone who sinned boldly, as Luther advised his followers to do. It also had no place for rulers who were not good Christians. In sum, sin could be tolerated no more than idolatry, because both were avoidable, immensely displeasing to God and dangerous for the collective welfare of the community. These threads go into interesting places. Another innovation that could be called an institution, even though it had no name, was the centralization of all the city's charities under the supervision of the civil authorities. Now, this gets very interesting because, again, in a lot of conservative Christian communities, there's a lot of complaint about the government, Social Security, welfare. What's this going to come from? Well, I'm not going to read about the Radical Reformation, but that becomes another focus. So Mennonites, for example, might, but you see, the Radical Reformation, there's a whole spectrum in those ranks too. But Zwingli very much believed, well, I'll keep reading. Care for the poor and needy had always been a high priority for Zwingli and an essential component of his iconoclastic theology. Like Karlstad, who linked the destruction of images with the abolition of begging, isn't that interesting? Zwingli argued that a Christian community had a duty to manage its collective wealth carefully and effectively. Now, later on, with Mennonites and Hutterites, you'd have much more of a common goods practice. That, talk to Julian about that. Like Karlstad, who linked the destruction of images with the abolition of begging, Zwingli argued that a Christian community had a duty to manage its collective wealth carefully and effectively, high taxation rates, to alleviate or eliminate poverty and sloth. Christian charity, Zwingli argued, was too important and too complex a task to leave in the hands of individuals or guilds or confraternities. Consequently, as the monasteries and convents were confiscated by city officials, the endowments for masses and chapels seized, and the church plates melted down, the revenue was funneled into the town treasury and much of it earmarked for charitable purposes. This is really interesting because later, again, in the Radical Reformation, with the Hutterites and other more radical communities, which could also go Utopian, they looked at, where are they going with this? They also managed it collectively, but they were much more antithetical to governing authority. They were anti-magisterial, let's say. Laws were passed against begging that distinguished between the deserving poor, that is, those who had genuine need, and the undeserving poor, those who were too lazy to work. Begging was outlawed, and a badge system created, whereby only those who had been designated as deserving of charity could receive alms. In other words, you had the government basically saying, you're allowed to panhandle on the street, you're not. Can I see your panhandling license? Fascinating. The system of identifying and funding the deserving poor was handled at the parish level, but its uniformity was ostensibly guaranteed by the city's laws. And so Zurich was turned into a Christian city, where faithfulness, godly behavior, and efficient charity were to be the norm rather than the exception. The idea of establishing such a sacral community wholly dedicated to Christian principles was not new. In theory, at least, this had been the goal of all medieval communities. But now, however, that theory had been put into practice in such a way that the civil authorities were granted much more of the power that the clergy formerly reserved for themselves. A big piece of this, too, is taking away political power from the clergy. There's something Sam Harris could get behind. In the medieval world, in many ways, clergy were above the law. In the Zwingli and Reformed, clergy were below the law, and in fact, in many ways, clergy were supervised by the civil magistrates. Now, I look at Christian Reformed practices, and it's interesting. There's a tinge of Anabaptistry in it. There's some Lutheranism in it. There's obviously a lot of Calvinism, and there's some Zwingli too. It's interesting how this works. And a lot of these ideas will get played out in different ways than in the Radical Reformation and in the various different things. And he goes into all of that in the book. Really enjoying the book. Where was I? Now, however, that the theory had been put into practice in such a way that the civil authorities were granted much of the power that the clergy formerly reserved for themselves. This puritanical reforming impulse would become the ethos of the Swiss Reformation, evident in all the cities and cantons that abolished images and the Mass. It would also reach beyond the Swiss Confederation to cities such as Strasbourg, Ulm, and Geneva, and take root in France, the Netherlands, Scotland, England, and in North American colonies. This distinctive collusion of church and state, and this sense of building a purified, faithful Christian republic, which were inseparable from a theology of election, would become the most recognizable features of the Reformed Protestant tradition. When John Winthrop admonished the New England-bound Mayflower Puritans, we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, quote, Ronald Reagan used, the eyes of all people are upon us. Zwingli Zurich was his paradigm, whether or not they knew it. And here he takes a chart from George Hunston Williams about how the Radical Reformation can be split up. You have the Anabaptists, which are sort of the mainstream evangelical New Testament model. You had pacifists, Swiss Brethren, Hutterites, Mennonites. Contemplative mystical, individualistic, influenced by mystics Hans Denk. Revolutionaries, violent, apocalyptic, Munster. What's interesting is that you see the menu of impulses just played out on the contemporary political American stage as well. Does it come from it? Are these psychological? Are these part and parcel of political engagement? You have the spiritualists. Mainstream evangelical, spiritual perfection manifest later in pietism. Contemplative mystical, individualistic, influenced by medieval mystics. And the revolutionaries, violent, apocalyptic. Thomas Munster is one of the great, most popular examples. Then you had the evangelical rationalists and anti-Trinitarians. Erasmians, libertines, and Nicodemonites. I look forward to reading about these people. I haven't gotten through that chapter yet. Skeptics and rationalists and anti-Trinitarians. Fascinating stuff. Andreas Boden van Karlstad, Thomas Müntzer, and the Zwickau prophets and the revolution of the common man proved beyond a shadow of the doubt that Martin Luther's leadership was questionable. More than 40 years ago, the German historians Franz Lau tried to put this insight into perspective by speaking of the wild growth of Reformation ideas that took place in the early 1520s. As Lau said, focusing too much on Luther could be a mistake, for if one looked beyond Wittenberg, and even if one looked at Wittenberg itself, it was easy to see that there were more ideas at play than those of Luther, and that reform was not necessarily driven by theological concerns or even by historical dynamics imagined by Luther's followers. Lau's contention was perceptive, but hardly novel. Even in Luther's own day, there were those who saw him as only one of many characters on a crowded stage. To some Catholics, for instance, Luther was one among a horde of heretics, merely a single branch of an old tree that suddenly sprouted exuberant new growth in 1517, an evil tree with roots as deep and ancient as those of the church itself, and branches as numerous as all the devils in hell. For those who did not follow Luther's lead, but also sought to break with the past, the image of wild growth was definitely perceptible, but with a different twist. For them, Luther's role in the wild growth was ambiguous or negative. Luther perceived the wild growth too, but he saw all others who challenged him in any way as branches that need to be cut off. Luther's personality. The images of furiously branching trees or invasive brambles that are evoked by the concept of the wild growth of the early Reformation are apt. For it was indeed an abrupt burst of religious energy that expanded very rapidly and in many directions, and in diverse places, all at once, and not to everyone's delight. And again, when you hear this, might there have been a technological advance at that same time that allowed ideas which probably were sort of living down below the surface, now suddenly, with a few people who can write and some printing presses, whoosh! These ideas are manifest and popularized, and people can gather around them. And so people within Europe will start going to places and let's go find Erasmus, let's go find Luther, let's go find Zwingli, let's go to Calvin's Geneva. The internet is that on steroids. Much like fractals, those complex repeating patterns in nature such as trees, leaves, river systems, and blood vessels that mathematicians can turn into equations, the history of the Protestant Reformation can be systematically comprehended only through multiple narratives that parallel each other in time and even mirror each other, but sometimes interlace and branch out. And when it comes to the earliest branchings, none was more significant than what took place in the Swiss Reformation. And then I read Peugeot. In the context of creation and the Garden of Eden, the word Adam simultaneously refers to an individual and humanity at large. That's true. Apostle Paul does the same thing. Such interpretations are possible because Adam is the principle of the entire human race, which is multiplied by male-female dichotomy. As a result, humanity, or Adam, can increase the size of his body to populate the entire world. And in many ways, we see that these ideas have people. Do the people have ideas? So I don't think I'm going to dive into... don't think I'm going to dive into the language of creation right now. But it was interesting because I was reading ahead a few chapters thinking about this when I was also reading about the Swiss Reformation and thinking this distinction in terms of material mediation versus much more of a divided universe where there's immaterial mediation. It's going to be interesting to think about that as we take a look at, sons of the Radical Reformation who return back to Orthodoxy. So Let me know what you think.